Hi, I'm John Atack, and today I'm going to be talking with my good friend Chris Shelton about some issues he's been having in his life. And I hope that you'll enjoy what we have to say, and it is informative to you.
Hi, John. Welcome back. I'm so glad to be talking to you again.
Likewise, always, always, always.
A big time. All right, I took to heart our last conversation about brainwashing, which I think I just posted. As we're recording this now, that podcast will be going up in a couple days.
Yeah.
I I always keep little post-it notes when I'm talking to you because you have so many wonderful references to things, and I have found myself over the years following in your footsteps in many ways in terms of learning. Not necessarily in terms of what we're doing, but in terms of learning about this stuff and rolling this stuff out. And you've been an amazing source of that for me on this stuff. And I just watched One Child Nation. Probably one of the most powerful documentaries I've ever seen.
Definitely.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. I'm still reeling right now from the experience of it because it is so heart-wrenching. And I don't use terms like that. I try not to use terms like that too loosely. But I really felt like my heart was wrenched out of my chest a few times watching that.
Yeah.
And I've come to, there's a conversation I've been wanting to have with you here, and so I'm going to ask you about this, and that is that over the years that I've been doing this, I have run into some problems personally from my background of Scientology and Save the World and Let's Help Mankind and this true desire to help. And I've come to learn that I bought into all of it. I really, really, truly did. I sincerely thought that's what we were doing. Yeah. I have found many other ex-Scientologists did not. They were there for more selfish reasons, or they were there because they didn't have anything better to do. I mean, I've actually heard that, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera.
I had a guy who told me he went back in because he couldn't sell his artwork to anybody else, and he did OT8.
Wow. So it's been a little surprising to me over the years to learn about different people's motivations for things. Mm-hmm. And why we act the way we do. And this has been probably the key question that's driven me for so many years is why. First off, it was how do we avoid getting people into cults? How do we avoid that? How do we stop these groups? And then I've come to learn that there isn't really any stopping them. It's just a matter of education and maybe regulation in some form or another where it's grossly lacking. But for the most part, people are just going to do what they're going to do, and they're going to believe what they want to believe, and there isn't really a whole lot you can do about it except try to help educate people to think better, more cleanly, more rationally, more factually is what I mean by that when I say more better. That's not a moral statement.
Yeah, but also more compassionately.
Well, for sure. Tolerance and compassion. Absolutely. For sure. So to be as blunt as possible, and this could come across as really offensive or judgy, I guess, but I am including myself in this mix when I say this. I have felt a few times a wall of despair in trying to help people because they seem to demonstrate on a mass level, almost never individually, but on a mass level, they demonstrate that our species is a short-sighted, very stupid species that seems to want to act against its best interests almost every time they're given a choice, one way or the other, about something sensible to do or not. And I am starting to despair about that. And I wanted to ask you, what have you done when you've run into that?
Well, yeah, I had a huge dose of it because I had 12 years of doing my best to help people who are involved with Scientology, or had been involved, and it was astonishing how ungrateful people were. That over that period of time, I dealt directly with about 500 people. I get a Christmas card from one of them, and when people get into trouble again years later, I get a phone call to help them out. I didn't charge, I generally didn't charge people money. And it became, I had to somehow to support myself so that I could do this to help people. And I didn't feel particularly noble either. I should have got some kind of narcissistic buzz from it, but I just felt foolish much of the time that,
right.
Why am I doing this to myself?
Yeah.
So, and I then, was litigated, steamrolled, bankrupted, lost my 5-bedroom house, my health went, so I had the consequences visited upon me. My marriage failed. Friends then, one of my dearest friends then sued me.
Oh my God.
For undue influence of all things, for mind control, basically. And that meant that any money that could have come back from the house, the 5-bedroom house, was lost. And it just, people who I considered my friends, 2 or 3 of them wrote affidavits against me, claiming things which thankfully I could disprove from documentary evidence. But I had a couple of years there where I felt very much alone, very isolated. I was looking after my ailing mother. My father had died. So my mum was 77 then, and I looked after her for the next 17 years, which was a real privilege. She was fantastic. She was wonderful. But she was also not very well through a lot of that period. And I couldn't go out and make relationships and have new friendships because it had been made very clear that if I did, Gene Ingram or somebody, other private detective, would go along to these people and their families and tell them, we're investigating him for criminal, So I didn't want to bring anybody into my life because of the danger to them. So existence became very difficult. And I went over and over what these, relatively small group of people had said about me and were attacking me for, and was sort of going, well, there must be something dreadfully wrong with me. I'm not seeing it. I must have these terrible blind spots that people are so offended. And I came to realize that the offense was largely that I'd not saved them, that I'd not been the daddy they wanted or the guru they wanted. And I'm sorry, but, I'm a father only to my own children. I'm not really seeking to, be a guru or anything of that. In fact, my whole thing since I left Scientology in 1983 has been anti-guru. It's been, we have to grow up, mature, become our own. When your parents die, you have to take that role on. Anything you were taken from there, by now you should be grown up enough to do it, hopefully. It doesn't mean you won't be wistful if there were decent people about them not being there, but we have to grow up. And I went from having had a lifelong sense of philanthropy and the need to ameliorate, to make the world a better place, to do something, which carried me all the way through Scientology. Just like you, I was a true believer. I really thought that these were the tools that would help humanity, and it would be positive, it would be good. Unlike you, of course, I didn't experience the horrors of this organization. And it meant that I was never abused or humiliated. When Kendrick Moxon in a deposition said to me, were you brainwashed in Scientology? I said, no, hypnotized a bit, but not brainwashed. And I came away feeling okay. I didn't have to go through any recovery process. I didn't have post-traumatic stress. There hadn't been any stress, really. I just had 9 years of these lovely people, and we do all these things. And I had one thing, which was a sense of guilt that I hadn't realized the treatment that was being given to SEAL members in particular, to staff members in general. And I felt really guilty about that in 9 years, nobody had told me about rice and beans diets or, wearing the black and not having a mattress and, 90-hour weeks and, not seeing the children and all of that stuff. I suppose I'd seen a little bit of the not seeing the children because I was in a house run by a SEAL member who was put on the rehabilitation project force, and he didn't get to see his 2-year-old all that much. But it did, then suddenly you're the other side of the looking glass, and you realize that everything is the opposite to what you thought, that this is not a way of making you self-determined. This is a way of controlling you. This is not a way of making you powerful. This is a way of controlling you. This is not a way of making you be able to have new and original creative thoughts. This is a way of pouring L. Ron Hubbard's thoughts into your head. So you believe those things. So I had a tremendous sense of liberation the first year I left. It was great. I didn't have to conform my thinking to anyone anymore. I could think what I liked, you know. But you know, the end of 12 years, when things started coming apart, I shifted from that philanthropy, from that sense of wanting to help anybody and everybody. And I knew that some people were malignant. I knew there were narcissists and psychopaths in the world, and I wanted to help them too, you know, goody two shoes or what. And then
I'm with you, man. I'm just so far totally.
Yeah, I mean, when Hubbard died in '86, I cried because I'd wanted to sit with him in prison and help him, you know. And you know, with Miscavige, I wouldn't take his inhaler away from him, you know. I might try and take the cigarette from the other hand, but I wouldn't take his inhaler away from him, you know. I wouldn't wish to harm him in any way, even though I don't have a tremendous respect for him, I must admit. So well, it's just the way I was brought up. But my philanthropy shifted, and I started to actually feel pretty negatively about the human animal, that we're gullible. It's very easy, you know, if you start, you know, One Child Nation seeing that babies can be murdered and thrown away as medical waste on rubbish tips, and you've got the pictures of it in the documentary. What? The whole culture can do this.
And let me please also comment that not only thrown on the trash heap, out of sight, out of mind, but left in the central market on the, you know, on the butcher's table. Babies were being left in baskets and they died.
Live babies that just died there.
And people just, you know, shopped around them. It's unfathomable to me that human beings can act that way. And I've read about Nazi atrocities. And yet that this is human beings, you know. Yeah. It's very, very hard to grapple with that.
It is, and I mean, in looking at Nazi atrocities, you know, there's a documentary series. God, here I am adding to your post-it notes, called "The Nazis: A Warning from History," and in it you see. There's an interview with a guy where he's saying, well, we always got on really well with the Jews in our village. And we, you know, when we gathered the harvest, they'd come and help us. We'd go and help them. We went to school with them. They were our friends. But they had different holidays and things, you know, something like this. And then the Germans came, and he's in Belarus or the Ukraine or somewhere. Then the Germans came, and we helped them murder these people. And as you say, you know, your hope in humanity is punctured. I think there are a very small number of people. 2% is the number that Robert Hare and others give, who are psychopaths. They couldn't care less about anybody else. There are then people who are borderlines who care on a Wednesday but don't care on a Thursday. You know, that they move between. The philosopher Schopenhauer, who I haven't read, but I have read this about him, reckoned that about 60% of human beings are just animals, beasts. And of course, Stanley Milgram came to about the same number, that 60% of people would be willing to shock another human being that they'd never met to death. And then you get to, I think she's Jane Ferguson, who's at Nottingham here. And she reckons, I think we talked about this a little, that you have sociopaths, empaths, and apaths. There are three kinds of people.
I was actually going to bring this up if you didn't. Yeah, because I had a point on this. Yeah.
So, and that's the idea which Martin Luther King made, that it isn't the evil people that are really the problem. It's the people who go along with it. It's the people who say nothing and do nothing. Now, I derive hope from history. I derive hope from relationships with people I know and from things that have happened. From history, if I look back, you know, to the 19th century, which we call the Victorian period, of course, in Britain, Queen Victoria, bless her. Very small person, by the way, not very tall at all, Queen Victoria, and yet she had 9 children and loathed them all. You know, she wrote to her oldest daughter, Vicky, who was an empress before Victoria was, which didn't. She wrote to her that you will almost always find that children are a disappointment. She's writing to her own daughter. But, whatever. During that age of humanity, when you look at the horrific mistreatment of the poor, when you go, there was no age of sexual consent. When it was introduced, it was 12 in this country. Children were being sold for a bottle of gin. That the conditions were absolutely awful, which in part can be blamed on the Industrial Revolution, which, while it gave us technology and metal cooking pots and things that wouldn't break like clay ones, and great stuff like that, and railways, it also brought with us this infliction of distress upon the majority of the population. When you look at the way that, say, Carnegie treated the Chinese coolies who built the Pacific Railroad, that thousands of these poor people died because of they'd set off some dynamite and a few of them would be too close to it. There was no health and safety, no hard hats. And the response to that, of course, in the US was to make it illegal for the Chinese to immigrate. They were the first banned population around about 1900. They then declared opium illegal, not the nasty refined forms of it like heroin, laudanum, what have you, morphine, but the smoking stuff, because the Chinese population had been hooked on it by the British. No shit,
is that how that happened?
Oh yeah, the opium trade began in Bengal, Clive of India. The poppy fields came up, and the Chinese fought 2 opium wars to try and stop the British from pouring opium into China. And it just became very much like alcohol in Western society. People still in China will go and smoke a pipe of opium at lunchtime and then go back to work in the afternoon, because it's not as heavy duty as certainly as fentanyl and carfentanil and these horrific things that are being, all of them made by pharmaceutical companies, by the way, heroin, cocaine, that they were developed along with Pepsi-Cola and Coca-Cola by pharmaceutical companies. Bless them all. Drug dealers, as we call them when we want to use the other term for what they do. But and then the whole war on drugs comes out of that, because America realizes it can make a deal with the Chinese to make opium illegal, which is what the Chinese have been trying to do for a long time. And that's where the Harrison Act and all of that stuff comes from. But looking back, the way that people have treated people has changed because of the law, because laws have been brought about. And we are now finding out about horrific abuse of children throughout the world, by all sorts of groups and organizations, the Boy Scouts, the
Catholic Church,
also, and orphanages, children's homes. I feel, however, that there has been some progress. So, for example, the beginning of World War I in this country, people cheered and ran to go and, lose their lives in the trenches. And the suffragettes stopped campaigning for women's votes by accepting a deal that they would hand out white feathers to any man who was not in uniform. So they became part of the government's propaganda machine, and they were granted the vote. It's an insidious world we live in.
Jesus.
When the second Iraq war, or the invasion of Iraq, or whatever we want to call it, happened here, in 2002, there were massive protests. 1 million people marched in London with placards saying, "Not in my name." That moral change, that sense of, we shouldn't be doing that, and we are responsible. The astonishing, the individuals, people like Naomi Klein, for example, who have really done the work. I'm reading, what's his name, Stephen Zinser, I think, at the moment, about, how there was a democracy in Iraq in 1953, which was destroyed by the US and Britain, by Churchill and Eisenhower. And the actual agent was Kermit Roosevelt, who was kind of a strange mixture of the illustrious Roosevelt name and the Muppets. Kermit Roosevelt. I mean, what were they thinking? Kermit.
Right.
What's wrong? That when we look at the history of the 20th century, the horrors in the Middle East, the awful things that were done to the Arab populations there, and then putting dictators like the Shah of Iran, in charge of them, and teaching them how to use car bombs, which of course the CIA taught the use of that, and things like the report that I think that there is a shift in moral conscience. I think that there are a lot of us now who would like to see the laws, so that the Geneva Conventions should be applied. In my lifetime, that's happened in Britain. In 1971, you had the interrogation of many people who just picked up off the street with the suspicion that they were members of the Irish Republican Army, and many of them weren't. And they were put through hooding and stress positions, not allowed to use the toilet facilities, which is not always mentioned as part of the process at Guantanamo Bay. Dropped from helicopters. They'd go up in a helicopter, put them in a bag and drop them. And they were only being dropped like 3 or 4 feet. But you don't know that when you fall out of the helicopter. So, and there are people who still, to this day, are suffering the effects of what was done to them in that brief period. That brought Britain into the courts in Europe. Britain objected to it being called torture. I think that's just, wordmongery. And it was eventually...
Yeah, there's no other word for it.
Yeah, it was. The court worded it as cruel and inhumane treatment. But I think things started to change then. And we then got a Police and Criminal Evidence Act that said you've got to record all interviews. What's more, if they're not recorded, they're not admissible in court. Just because a policeman wrote it in his notebook, we don't trust you anymore. And now we've got body cams, so that we had an incredible drop in complaints about the police when they started wearing body cams. Yeah, because
I thought that was one of the most brilliant ideas ever. I did not know statistically about that in Britain, but I thought here in the U.S. it should be mandatory. If you're on the job, that camera is on. Yeah. And I was shocked at the pushback I got on that.
Yes, that there are people who don't mind there being surveillance cameras everywhere and facial recognition, but they don't want the police to be held accountable. It's like
I know you just the mind reels, because without accountability, it just seems like in a very general sort of sense. Without, especially from authority figures, without transparency and without accountability, abuse is almost guaranteed.
Yes, and it's the corruption of mind. It's the idea that it's all right to do this. I mean, we still do have a problem with the police, which is that the police are a cult. They are a group of people who have tremendous loyalty to one another, which will allow them to break the law, particularly in not giving testimony against their fellows. You find this in the Buddhist community as well, where they're saying, well, I didn't see him do it, so therefore I don't have to say anything about it. I saw the blood on the floor afterwards, but I didn't see him do it. I think that promoting responsibility in people, okay, it might be a very slow journey. Looking back at civil rights in the US, but it is a journey that is making some headway. I think that there are still dangers, and for me, the worst of them is that we've moved into a plutocracy. We've moved into, people talk about capitalism. I'm not bothered about capitalism. That's not a problem. It's plutocracy. It's where a group of people have so much money that they decide what happens. And right. The Democrats, the Republicans, the Tories, we have some difference here in our Labour Party in that it's supported by the trade union movements financially. But, there has also been corruption there. But it means that the trade union movements also become part of a plutocracy because they have the money to lobby. They have the money to do these things. And democracy is... Edward Bernays, the wonderful fashioner of the 20th century, who never moved away from the word propaganda, he never talked about public relations. He put forward the view in the 1920s that, of course, we want full democracy, but until people are educated enough, we can't risk it. So we must use propaganda to control them. And he complimented Goebbels on his use of his techniques.
And that absolutely, that attitude carries forward to today. Just last week, Mike Bloomberg on camera at the international, what is it? The international IMF, International Monetary Fund. The president of the IMF sitting right next to him on stage. Michael Bloomberg is like, we know best what these populations need, and it is our job to control and move them in such a way and ban things that are not good for them and stop them from having things because we know what's best for them. And this guy's running for president right now here in the U.S. And I'm like,
made all of his money
don't walk from that guy. You know what I mean? And here's the president of the IMF, who is the person who is like the final stamp on whether countries are going to get loans. You know, in Africa and South America, et cetera.
Whether they're starve or not.
Yeah, exactly. And these are the people who actually hold, their hands are on the levers of power. You know, these are not lightweights. These are the people, and this is the current thinking as of now. So, yeah.
Again, Adam Curtis, who's probably addressed every problem there is at some time or another. I've found a documentary I hadn't seen. It's a series called Pandora's Box that he made in 1992. I saw somebody talking about him being alternative media. I'd just like to point out his whole career has been with the BBC. You know, he sits in the archives at the BBC and they publish these astonishing critiques of our society. In Pandora's Box, he looks at the way that the Russians tried social engineering, and that was their fundamental project under Stalin, to engineer society, and how that notion crept into the West, that you could treat people as cogs in a machine, you could make things work. And what we've seen is, and with hypernormality is more recent work, we've seen the collapse of morality at the top levels of government. We've seen people who are willing to, you know, as Barack Obama was, to take the Nobel Peace Prize one week and to send 30,000 more troops in the next, and then to refuse for 10 weeks to even talk to the guy standing McChrystal who'd put in charge of them. So even somebody who, you know, and again, he stopped the torture report from coming out. So, you know, you couldn't seem more noble and decent than Barack Obama. You couldn't seem more intelligent and caring than Barack Obama, but he made a deal with the devil. And, you know, politically, I think the Greta Thunberg response is the response, bless her, that she's just saying, you know, I'm mad as hell and I'm not going to take it anymore. You know, I'm not going to school on Fridays anymore because you guys aren't doing your job, you know. And for me, the whole society is at a point of, you know, a tipping point, which is not simply about climate change, which is extraordinarily important, because if the environment starts to degrade, and it appears to be happening, you know, with more hurricanes, more fires, you know, more things happening, then things could go very badly wrong very quickly. And our systems are not built to survive that. You know, if you take out the internet, then, you know, we wouldn't be able to have this conversation. So where would we be, you know?
Well, I'll tell you, people right now, the last generation or two who did not ever live without the internet are, you know, could be in for some rather rude awakenings. So, I mean, you and me, I mean, we understand what life is like without the internet. You can get along. There's things you can do. We had telephones, we had telegraphs. I mean, really, if you really want to take it back to the telegraph, that's really where things changed. But
I'm keeping pigeons, you know. I mean,
yeah, but yeah, the point you just made about the systems is absolutely right. We have put so much dependency on these electronic systems,
and our hospitals won't work without them. Our police won't work without them.
That's right.
Our food delivery won't work without them, and you know, because we were in Scientology, so we were kind of semi-survivalists. You know, I do know how to boil my water, and you know,
right, me too.
I want Scientologists to survive World War III.
That's right.
But I do have, you know, I have this passion, which is that we have trod a similar path, that we both deeply believed, and we believed for the right reasons. And
right.
because we believed for the right reasons, it meant that when we left, we wanted to do something about it. And I don't think either of us thought about the consequences. I know that, I held the first public meeting of ex-Scientologists in the UK ever, quite by accident. I didn't set it up. I just happened, the guy who was meant to be running it was John Mace, and he went back to Australia 2 weeks before, and it got dumped on me to do. But there at the door were two members of the Guardian's office taking our names as we went in. And I didn't understand what that meant, but I pretty soon came to understand what it meant. So we do what we do, and we face, there was a significant amount of pressure involved, let's put it that way. A push from the other side to stop us doing what we're doing, a tremendous amount of hostility and aggression. And I never took never taken sides, because I don't see there are any sides. There's the human race and death. Those are the two sides. And I'm life affirming. I'm for Eric Fromm. So when people call me an anti-Scientologist, I say, no, I am anti-Scientology. I do think that Scientology is dangerous, and I'll tell you why if you've got a week to listen. But I'm absolutely pro-Scientologist. When the blessed Pete Griffiths of SPs Are Us, who is a dear friend of mine, when I got the call to go to flag down at Clearwater, I was told I was the first person to be asked to speak, and I said no, absolutely not, because what's that going to do to the poor Sea Org members? I look to the day when Scientology implodes. They're the people that need the help, and you're just going to reinforce their fear. You're going to make them, feel they're right to be afraid of the outside world. What can we do to communicate with them? So I said, why don't we start a letter writing campaign where people write nice, friendly letters, or emails through an anonymous account, nice, friendly emails to the letter registrars, because then they're getting their statistics, right? So they're getting letters in, and they're responding, and you just have nice conversations with them. You don't have to talk about Scientology at all. You can talk about humanizing their situation, which is sort of, tell me about your past, tell me about what you do, tell me about what you believe, what music do you like? Have real conversations with people instead of hurling brickbats and, being in the anger part of the Kubler-Ross, recovery process, which is where so many people are. But for me, there are stages, and we were going to talk about this at some length, perhaps in another conversation. But it's somebody published the Bridge Out of Scientology back in the 90s. I did a tentative one in about 84, which was, well, first of all, somebody in the organization does something horrible, and you think, oh, I don't agree with that, so you complain about it, and nothing happens. So it took me 6 months complaining about a friend being declared suppressive by his name being put on a list. And I'm saying, no, he didn't have a committee of evidence. There were no, findings and recommendations. 6 months later, having been to the International Justice Chief and having written a letter to Ron, I found out that they weren't going to do anything. So you become disheartened with the organization and you come away from it. Then you'll tend to look at the ethics policy and say, well, that's a bit harsh. Then you'll find out about the harassment policy, which you probably knew nothing about. And you go, well, certainly don't want to do that. Then you'll question Hubbard himself. You'll read something and go, oh. And then you'll realize that he was a liar. There are no two ways about it. He contradicted his own statements about his own past. Crippled and blind at the end of World War II, or I didn't have any war wounds in the December 1950 issue of Look. So then there's desperately holding on to the tech. Okay, he was an evil person, but he did this good work. He was a bad person who enslaved people, who treated them horrifically, threw them off a boat and took pictures, a ship, and took pictures of it. The Auditor 41, the centre spread. I didn't see that when I was a member. After I left, somebody dumped a set of these things, and I open it, and it says, photo credit, L. Ron Hubbard, and here's the guy being thrown overboard by Baron Perez, of all people.
That's right. Just so listeners know, since this is for an audience here,
Wandered
guys.
into Scientology again.
Well, yeah, just so you guys know, I mean, Hubbard literally would throw people off the side of a boat, and
Hoverboard.
this was probably about 2-3 stories high,
About 25
into the
feet.
ocean, right? As a
Yep.
disciplinary measure. This was something
Well,
he was,
not into the ocean. Not into the ocean. Let's be exact. Into the sea.
oh, okay, of course. And there was a little ritual about we cast your sins into the sea or some nonsense, and he would literally film this. And he would have his this was 1968, 1969 time period, and there was a whole ceremony, and this went on for quite a while. And it was just brutal, and particularly horrible when people were blindfolded and bound with their hands and feet bound by rope because they had particularly nastily screwed up, and Hubbard wanted them to suffer for that. So that's what we're talking about here. This was not a 1 or 2 off thing that Hubbard pulled. This was a ritual he put in place.
Every day. And he'd gone in 1950 from saying, when he starts up, we're going to relieve trauma in people and the consequences, to 1968, we're going to inflict trauma on you if you don't do as you're told. Yeah. And putting kids in the chain lockers in the filthy place where the chain is stored, where there'd be rats and stinking bilge water, it'd be totally dark. A child of 4 or 5 was put in there for several days by Hubbard. So it shifts over and you get this real nasty. So people realize that Hubbard was not a nice guy, but they still believe, but these techniques work. Then the next thing is realizing that the techniques do work. They do what they say they'll do, which is they give you very good indicators, which is they make you feel euphoric.
That's right.
Because just about any hypnotic procedure will do. Then you start realizing that you can actually label what form of hypnotic technique you're looking at. As if you dare cross over that border and think about hypnosis, because you're not meant to talk about it. Hubbard, of course, said you cannot be an auditor unless you've studied hypnosis. But that statement is buried.
Very buried.
1951. I wrote a paper called Never Believe a Hypnotist. And if you want to upset Scientologists, that's the one to use. Because it's just Hubbard saying, hypnosis was never used in development of Dianetics on one page of Dianetics among Science of Mental Health. Another 3 pages later, he's saying it's all based on hypnosis.
Yeah, it's pretty bad how blatant he could be about it.
Yeah, and because I interviewed Don Rogers, who was there when he wrote the book, and Don said, he was using deep trance hypnosis up to the point where Art Sepos commissioned the book, and he turned around to me and said, well, hypnosis isn't very popular, is it? We'll have to do something else. So there was no research for the Dianetic reverie or light trance method. So you've got this guy who's doing all this stuff, but people come out in their stages. There are a lot of people who go into denial. They'll sort of say, well, I'm fine. All I have to do is walk away from it and never think about it again. Doesn't work that way.
No, it does not.
You come to believe something, then that's what you believe. And until you address it head on and say, I believed this, do I believe it now? And you have the choice. You can talk about it, think about it, read about it, and you can go, well, do I believe that that's true? And if you don't, it will govern you. It will taint the way you look at people. From there, you go, of course, Kubler-Ross, into anger. And people will get mad about it. Then they'll get mad with one another and they'll start shouting. And, you've been on the receiving end, I know it.
And the giving end, I have to admit. I've been all over the spectrum. And every point you've talked about here, I have lived through each of these, yes.
Yeah. And I got into this thing of like, if you can undo the dogma, you undo the whole thing. And that is getting somebody to talk about the 8 dynamics or affinity, reality, and communication equal understanding. If you increase somebody's communication, will you always increase the affinity, as Hubbard said? And you go, well, he also said bullets are communication. So by increasing the amount of bullets I fire at somebody or yelling at somebody, it's just not true.
Right.
And it's fundamental to the belief system. And when you start pulling those things out, then they're the kind of suggestions, the positive suggestions that keep people going along this desperate track to try and achieve these magical abilities that they somehow don't have yet, even though they've spent $500,000. It ties people in. But for me, the point of our conversation here is the point that I arrived at, which is that I think that recovery only occurs when you understand how it happened and what happened, and you have your own take on it. It's not, well, John Atack and Chris Shelton say this, so therefore that's what happened. It's like, well, this is what happened to me, and this is what I actually saw. And those guys have got a bit of a point about that. I don't agree with that thing they said, but this thing is, I saw that happening. I saw people on rice and beans diets for 6 months. I saw children on rice and beans diets for 6 months. Let's be fair about this. That's malnutrition, for children. Come on. Put it into their own experience, understand what they came to believe, think about the beliefs. But there is a line that you cross where you want to help people. And you and I were involved in Scientology because we wanted to help people. That's not to say we didn't want to help ourselves too. We didn't go in, as kind of flagellants, beating ourselves.
No, I did not go in with a martyr complex.
No. And
that's right.
But nonetheless, it meant enough for everyone. It meant help everyone. I think that thought is vital to our society, that yes, it's a great idea to say this group is bad, this group is bad, this group is bad, this is why this group's bad, and the thousands of groups out there that are harming people should be exposed. So when I look at the furore about the Jehovah's Witnesses at the moment, which I've been on the edge of for the last few years because I've worked with a lot of former Jehovah's Witnesses, and it's terrible, the things that have happened in there. But then you see this huge heaving mass of angry people who are not really quite sure how to make it better. They think that by, shouting at each other, they'll make it better. Some of them are tremendously compassionate people who, I know lots of people who are working on the child abuse cases and trying to do something about that, and that's great. But I think
Lloyd Evans is right right there over in Europe working on this. He's like my opposite number in the JW world.
Yeah, we have Patrick Hake, who's I think he's involved in 25 or 26 cases that where he's helping people, and of course these are people often who suffered terrible damage, because throughout childhood they were being abused. It's a part of Watchtower, the Jehovah's Witness Society policy to beat children. They beat them till they scream at the back of the Kingdom Hall if they make a noise during a service. I was shocked when I heard this. It's a policy of the Watchtower Society to go into prisons and recruit child molesters and forgive them and not do anything to restrain their access to children. They can marry a widow and, have 3 kids in the house right then and there, which is why when Barbara Anderson came out in about 2004, I think she talks about a list of 23,000 abusers being held by the Watchtower Society. So these are horrors, and somebody needs to do something about it. But I think that true recovery happens when you get that there's an underlying pattern in all of this. And that pattern is authoritarianism. That pattern is bullying. That pattern is, I'm cleverer than you, I'm better than you, I deserve to be, or in Matilda where Danny DeVito puts it to Maury Wilson, I'm big, you're little. I'm right, you're wrong. And there aren't many people that Danny DeVito can say, I'm big, you're little too, bless him. What a brilliant actor he is. But that attitude of mind in society, that, not giving people their rights, finding ways of, torturing people and pretending that you're doing something good. The idea that the report, the movie shows that the people in the CIA that did this are still there. James Mitchell, one of the 2 people who designed the program. You've got 2 guys designing the program. One of them had a PhD in family therapy and the other in nutrition. And they designed a torture program. And they were given immunity by the CIA. And they were given tens of millions of dollars by the CIA. And Mitchell has admitted that he personally waterboarded people. And it's like, you did what? And their waterboarding, of course, was actually drowning. They didn't just wet a cloth. They poured water through it into your lungs. Nobody's ever been prosecuted for this. Nobody's been dismissed from the CIA. I don't think that the Don is draining the swamp. I think the swamp is as fetid as it ever was, you know.
Oh, well, I have to agree with you, and this is exactly the thing I bump up against personally, going all the way back to how we started this conversation. This is these systems, this do-nothing attitude about these things is what I think makes me craziest.
Yeah.
You know, you expose, you understand, you try to teach. You try to get across to people that there is propaganda out there, that all of us are susceptible to it, that every one of you people out there who write comments about how I'm immune to all of that. You'd have to be an idiot to fall for this. What kind of moron would think Scientology is real? And you just want to go, you, dude, you're the kind of moron who would think this. Maybe Scientology and Xenu ain't your thing, and maybe it's JW's. Maybe it's Mormonism. Maybe it's Confucianism times, 10,000 or something. I don't know what your particular brand of crazy is, but there's not one human being on this planet who is immune from crazy.
No.
And that's the kind of thing that it just makes me a little crazy myself because you keep preaching this stuff and it's like, is nobody getting this? What am I doing here?
And it's accepting that you're not going to get through to everyone.
Right. Right.
I had a thing when I was in Scientology that it's just a personal thing, that if somebody did that kind of, I did one of those personality tests and it's stupid and I hate it and this, that and the other, I'd recruit them.
Right. Me too. Me too. I did it.
Yeah. And it comes up every time. The perception of your own invulnerability, the fundamental attribution error in psychology, the idea that other people, are
That's
taken in, but I'm not.
That's right.
That means you don't have any shield. I know I'm gullible. It's like Bob Cialdini in his wonderful book Influence, a must read for everyone. Yep. He introduces it by saying, I started the study of influence because I'm a patsy. Anyone can sell me anything. And I think it may still be true, poor Bob, but I know it's true for me that I have to back off and go, why am I getting involved with this story that this person is selling to me to take money from me? I don't, fortunately I don't have any money, so it works quite well.
That is one of the best ways to avoid getting scammed, is just not have any money in the first place.
Yeah, as Lao Tzu says, do nothing and everything will be done, have nothing and you still won't have anything.
That's right.
But the point is that sometimes you do get through. After it's 36 years now since I left, and the process I went through was, first of all, I want to know what had happened. I still believed in Scientology. What had happened to the organization? So I dug into that, and I got to interview lots of people. 3 people who'd been on the watchdog committee, the 14 rulers, a couple of the executive director internationals, 2 former heads of the Commodore's messenger organization. I just found these people wherever they were and wrote letters to them, because back then, we only had carrier pigeons. We didn't have email.
Right.
And met some wonderful people, people like Didi Vogadim, for example, who was just, or Hannah Whitfield, who was just so, willing to help me. And I read everything I could find, and it gradually became a history of the movement. It's just my obsessive nature, I think, my systematizing nature. And I, read testimony, and the thing was that the story became coherent, that there was very little contradiction between the accounts, despite what Gordon Melton and Brian Wilson, not the Beach Boy, have said about not trusting ex-members, discriminate against ex-members, take our rights away, because we're untrustworthy. I was astonished at how much the stories from different people all fitted together. But once I got a history of it, then I wanted to know, why did it work? Why did we become And so that led me off into the whole mind control business, and in the late 80s and 90s. And the next thing, having read about lots of other groups where it was happening, from time immemorial, kind of going, hang on, we're living in a culture which is full of cults. And I know Margaret Singer, when she wrote Cults in Our Midst, meant to say, that's just the way we are. We're human. We, just as the police will protect one another, we belong to groups, and we then can become rather irrational in our support of them. If my kids killed somebody, I'd probably help them bury the body. It's just right. Against my principles, but as long as they tell me the truth, that's the important part in relationship. Where is the body? Because I'm not going to be able to bury it unless you tell me exactly, I need the truth. I came to realize that it's our relationship with others that's important, not our enlightenment, not our achievement of magical powers. Couldn't care less about that. Not whether we live after death, which seems a bit contradictory to me as a thought. Whether we reincarnate, whether we have souls or any of this stuff, it's now and the relationships we have and how we behave. And that's not because of, I'm going to go to heaven or hell. It's because this is it now. This moment, how I behave now is who I am and is what's happening. And that has brought me happiness, which is not a quality that I see. I lived a very difficult life to get to this place. And I'm only able to be happy because I'm supported by, I have the charitable support of my own family, basically. One of my brothers and his wife, they're kind enough to allow me to, do pretty much what I want to do, which is try and help people in my own peculiar way. But I came to see that this is a fundamental human behavior, this authoritarianism, this wish to control others, this wish to be the person who's adulated, and revered for their greatness. And it's not about cults. It's not about multi-level marketing or large group awareness trainings, it's about fundamental attitudes towards other human beings. It's about, do you like people or don't you? It's about, and if you do like people, are you willing to like more of them? When the Truth and Reconciliation program happened in Northern Ireland, I don't think it was very successful in South Africa. I think it's a pretty terrible mess there. And a lot of people who should have gone to prison didn't, frankly. But in Northern Ireland, I saw this one case where there were women's groups that did this. They just went, we've had enough of this. It's got to stop. There was a case where a woman who had been in the Irish Republican Army had left because they'd gone and grabbed this special policeman, which is a volunteer policeman, who was a Protestant. They'd strapped him into a car and they'd then sent it rolling down a hill, and it blew up at the bottom of the hill. And she went, I don't want to be involved in this anymore. Years later, she finds herself in a room with that man's wife, expecting that the woman will hit her. And instead, the woman embraced her. So that's where I'm going, and that's why it's worthwhile. Because every now and then, we do get through, and people, once people really get it, and there are a very, very, very tiny amount of people who get it, they'll stop Scientology bashing, or bashing Scientologists, whatever, and understand the broader application, the importance of what you've been doing, to expose evil, to say this is corruption, this is injustice, this is the wrong way to behave, but to embrace a better way to behave. And for me, I saw it in 1991 when I'd published a piece of Blue Sky. I didn't want anything more to do with Scientology, frankly. I'd had 7 years of doing this and all sorts of harassment and horror, but I couldn't get away from it because, well, my first wife was determined to keep living in East Grinstead in our lovely 5-bedroom home. And it meant I had to earn enough money to sustain that, which meant I then shifted into doing exit counseling, and which was interesting. And, lots legal cases, I started charging properly for doing them for the first time, and almost made a living. But the legal costs to defend myself got to be too much. But I, at that time, started going, it's not only this isn't Scientology, this is endemic. Our whole society functions this way. And until people have enough to eat and shelter and clothing and friendships, things are going to go wrong. We're going to get dreadful overpopulation, for one thing. And people are going to be nasty. As long as we fight wars, and as long as we think wars are a good idea, we're not going to be able to sustain our environment. Any green policy, as long as warfare is still an aspect of human behavior, and all of the terrible proxy wars that China, Russia, and America, Britain, France, so many countries have fought. The arms dealing, we live in countries that are among the top 5 arms dealers in the world, arms manufacturers and dealers in the world, and also members of the UN Security Council, as Nicolas Cage's movie Lord of War kind of points out.
That's right. That's right. The hypocrisy, the ironies and hypocrisies that surround us are too numerous to enumerate. And they are so bald-faced in some fashions, in some ways, and very, very hidden in others. But it is. There are huge systemic issues.
Yeah, and I think that the solution to that is right in front of us. The solution is that we look to the next generation and we say, is it possible to teach kids not to be lured in by predators? And the answer is yes. How long does it take to recover from a predatory relationship? Oh, about 10 years, probably. A severe predatory relationship, even a personal relationship with somebody who's monstrous and controlling, years later. How long does it take to recover from a childhood of abuse? I don't know. I've met people who, it doesn't surprise me in the least that they're now in their 60s and still, their lives have been dominated by what happened to them as small children. They've never been able to socialize properly or connect properly because of what happened to them. So the recovery is a great long thing. The prevention, and this is, where I shifted to completely, I can teach somebody probably in a day everything they need to know to spot predators and the agents of predators and to understand the basic techniques that are always used in recruiting and seducing people. My frustration, of course, is that, there is no funding for this. And so you have to look at subversion. You have to say, well, how do you get it into society? Well, you start a YouTube channel.
That's exactly what you do.
Yeah.
That's right. It's the poor man's speaking box, It's the way to get anything out there. And people responding. Anyway, please continue.
So what happens if, a school teacher watching this says, well, they're right, I'd like to do something about that. Well, I have a couple of videos, one on human predator. There's another one on types of predator. There's another one on techniques of seduction and recruitment. And that will take you less than an hour to watch all 3 of them. And from there, is it possible to develop materials in the classroom? Very easy indeed. So, next year, I hope to actually design lessons. And, we've got this peculiar thing that in the UK, everything in the curriculum is controlled with this stupid standards movement. And, we don't bother to educate people. They just have to regurgitate, in 1066, this happened, in 1815, this happened. This is the name of the psychologist who said this. And all of this complete waste of time nonsense that it's because it's testable. And that means you can use statistics. And it's like, I don't care about tests and statistics. Can we produce competent people who know how to do stuff? They know how to mend a car, or they know how to, paint their bedroom, or they know how to cook. Cooking is quite useful. Or they know how to grow plants. I've found that very useful.
Balance a checkbook.
Yeah, balance of checkbook.
Critical
Exactly.
thinking. You know, they're
Yeah.
actually having some real success in Finland right now with a critical thinking program that is an anti-propaganda, anti-fake news program.
Mm.
And they're teaching high school and early college kids this stuff, and they're having success with it, which is why I bring it up. It's not just some rando program. I was just reading about this the other day.
Oh, send me a link to that. I mean, I have some familiarity with the Scandinavian systems because they keep being best in the PISA tables every 2 years, along
Yep.
with Shanghai of all places. But they, in Finland, you only, in the whole of your school, imagine this, to the age of 18, you sit one exam at the end. There's none
Wow.
of this, we cram this rubbish into your head. And they have I think they have the highest per capita income in Europe.
Yeah. Also rated all these countries that do this stuff. They are all in the top 5 of happiness, prosperity,
Healthcare.
stability. Yeah, healthcare. That's right. And I'm going to bring this up because it feeds into everything you've been talking about, and that is the urgent need, I think, and neurologically, in neuroscience, they are now, as though we didn't have Adele Davis and health and all this other stuff. Adele Davis, I know, I roll totally. But as though we haven't been being told by a lot of people that taking care of your body is a really good idea. Maybe the ways the means and methods of how you go about doing that have been up and down all over the place as medical science has rolled around all over the place with, is fat good or bad, is milk good or bad, is sugar good or bad, blah, blah, blah. But what's becoming super, super, super clear scientifically now, not just morally or philosophically, is if your body budget's out of whack, sleep, food, right? If
Exercise.
your body budgets how much energy it has. It's a machine. It's a biochemical machine. This is what it does. It does it 24/7. You're not aware of hardly any of it. Sometimes you hear a little burr, 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 or whatever from your GI system, and that's about the only awareness you got that shit's going on in here. But it's going on 24/7, and you've only got you could walk around with a meter, if this could be detected somehow, of where your body's energy is actually at compared to where it should be, right? What you actually need, what your basal metabolism might be,
Yeah.
to abscond with a word that Hubbard grossly misused. Right, you need a certain amount of energy for minimum functioning to occur, and then you have a standard of energy you need in order to actually think and do and operate rationally.
Very
That's
much.
called a body budget. That's what I call
Yeah.
this, right? This
Yeah.
is where
Yeah.
this
I'm
term comes
familiar
from.
with the expression. Yeah.
Yeah, and I want everybody to be, because I want you guys to get that so much of our state of mind, our ability to think, our ability to interact with other people depends on where you're at, where that body budget's at. If you're not fed, we know this with babies. This is what's so again, right? Is we know this with babies. Oh, the baby's crying. He or she, not enough food, not enough sleep.
Or a nappy change.
Yeah, exactly. 98%, 99% of your problems with any child are going to be one of those 3 things. Every mother knows this, right? You have special needs kids. You have special needs. I'm not trying to say that they don't exist.
Of course. Yeah.
But across a general spectrum of all of humanity, food, sleep, environment, right? A chill environment, not a torturous one.
Physical comfort and physical closeness.
Yes, there you go. These things, these small number of things, account for almost all of our behavior, good and bad. So where this goes, of course, is, what's the role of government? What's the role of society? Well, how about that everybody's fed and rested and able to work and just able to do these things? We don't think about
we
these
could spend
things
the
this
money
way.
on armaments and destroy Iran.
Right. Or we could do that. And I understand, and I want to ask you about this actually, because now that I've made this point, I wonder, history books are full of military conquests and military tension and all that, but that's not what all of history is made of. History is made of all the little moments as well as all the big moments, and all the little things as well as all the big things, and we've lost more than we'll ever know because
ideas and not battles mark the forward progress of mankind.
Actually, I'm going to say I'm going to say okay, good, true statement there.
Yes,
broken
what the ideas are.
Yeah, broken clock, all the and all that. But here's my question to you now, as a discussion point: is do you think, given the fact that you got me thinking in that last podcast where you talked about sociopaths, apaths, and empaths, and how history, from one historian's point of view that you quoted, is a series of sociopaths riling up apaths to destroy empaths, right? And you look at that and you go, that's interesting, because then I look at the 20th century, the period that has the most influence on where we're at right now. Hitler, Stalin, Mao.
This is sounding like a Randy Newman song all of a sudden. Hitler.
Is it?
Yeah.
Well, and I wonder, maybe somebody, I don't know, maybe somebody like the Un family, right? The Kim Jong-un and his line.
The Kim family, or Pol Pot, or Sukarno
right.
in Indonesia.
So I look at 3, 4, 5 people who I believe, I haven't gone and done the research, I haven't looked at all the numbers, but I believe the numbers are that these people in the last 100 years killed more people, are responsible for not only more deaths, but more physical destruction as well, around the world, internationally, than all of history combined.
Yeah, quite possibly, yeah.
Right. At least there's certainly a case to be made there that, I don't think the immediate response is, oh, no, that's not true.
Well, Mao is the top of the list with 70 million.
Yep. And then what is it? Is Stalin next or Hitler?
I think there's a lot of competitive tension between Stalin and Hitler.
Yeah, exactly. But that kind of thing happened in the last 100 years. How could that not have a detrimental effect on the psyche of every single living human being?
Yeah, but post-traumatic stress passing from generation to generation. If you look at the effect that the Iraq War has had on the US by the amount of poor returning combat veterans who themselves are, stressed out from their experiences, who are then passing that stress into their families, which is not being dealt with. I got very interested in this over the kind of hippie period, because I grew up, on the tail end of the hippie period here. I was 12 in the Summer of Love. And I met a lot of Americans in Scientology as well, and realized that hippies were different. And the difference was that you could get conscripted in the US and sent to fight a war that, now, Britain was fighting a war on a smaller scale in Borneo and Malaysia, but it was all very quiet, and there was no, we stopped conscription in around about 1960. There are still places like France is keen on it, Israel is keen on it, Switzerland's keen on it. So you actually put a generation through a military experience, and it may mean that their rooms are very tidy, which is a good thing. My room's not very tidy, but they may also live in a state of constant stress. Because, in fight, flight, freeze, or fawn, because they've been pushed into that. And you'll have a whole society. And looking at past societies, warfare has been, I think the longest period England, and I'm differentiating from Britain here, the longest period that England has had without war is 12 years. And that was in the run-up to the Civil War of the 1640s. And that was because the Parliament wouldn't fund the king to go and kill a load of Irish people. It then, after Cromwell took over, there was a genocide in Ireland. So this glory and warfare and machismo and all of this stuff, then the post-traumatic stress disorder, when, the little boy goes out and fights a war and comes back, with shell shock, with battle fatigue, neurasthenia, whatever we call it, post-traumatic stress disorder. And then we'll be fighting devils for the rest of his life. And
that's right.
so we have societies that, I think that the First World War, fundamentally, I'm a painter and art historian, honest, despite the impression I may be giving here. Up to 1914, there's this incredible burgeoning of art that begins in the 1850s, and it just keeps on going. And wonderful ideas are being presented. And then the First World War happens. Half of them are killed. And their friends who remain are traumatized. Oskar Kokoschka, the artist, decides that human beings are so disgusting that he's going to go and live with his anatomically correct doll in the mountains. And he does. Just horrible paintings as well, so it didn't work. But then you get World War II, and it's like, well, human beings are vile, and the arts, between the wars, the vital art, although there is still some good music being produced, particularly in Britain, actually. But for the most part, it's coming out of jazz. It's coming out of the, the meeting of the Jewish and African American communities that would become, swing and all of that. It then in the 50s, it comes out of rock music, which comes out of blues and soul and all of that. Not out of the serious places, because the people who are doing the serious art are all batshit crazy from what happened to them. So, we've now got Stockhausen playing the note C 147 times. And while it's very amusing having John Cage just 2 minutes of silence, though I did think the rehearsal was better than the performance. I agree with that. We move off into conceptualism. I recently posted a piece on art to talk about this, to talk about, because the culture and the cult, what we think, where we are morally. I think angst ruled the 20th century. I think hopelessness is a fundamental aspect of our culture, and sort of pasting it over with commercials and movies and Disney and all of that, instead of actually going, well, life can be good, and good things can happen, and we can change things and make them better. But we don't realize that the Matrix was not the first time that the idea was put forward that we live in a construction, but it puts it forward very well. And we do, but that construction is not a computer model. It's a culture. It's what we've accepted, what we've been taught. And I think a lot of the ideas, Ira Chalef's idea of intelligent disobedience, teach 5-year-olds to say, I don't think that's a good idea, rather than this, having to put your hand up if you want to pay a visit. There is so much that's so simple. And I see ideas breaking through into the culture in a very big way. That there are people like, say, Ken Robinson talking about education and having million-seller books. And I think that there is this push to kind of get the neocons and the neoliberals, tie them in a bag, throw them in the river, and get on with actually, living together and being helpful and kind and good. I think that the simplest answer to the original question, and I've said it often enough publicly, but some years ago I had a letter from a woman who said, you won't remember me. And to my shame, I don't remember her. You spent an afternoon with me 15 years ago, and I want to tell you that up until that point, my life was a chaos. She had been involved in Scientology. From that point onward, I am happily married. I have children who I love, and I have a career. And I attribute that to that turning point. Now, I attribute it entirely to her endeavor. I just happened to be the guy that sat and listened and said, no, you're fine, you'll be all right. I'm not sure it's ever much more than that. But that comes back and you say, if you touched one life, then you were successful. And certainly with what you're doing, you've touched tens of thousands of lives. And maybe you've touched some of them only a little bit. But even with the people who get mad at us, I've had people come to me years later and apologize. There's a guy who spread all sorts of bad stories about me after I left the cult. And he'd left as well, but he just hated me because I'm so smug and, he's probably quite right.
I know, I get the same thing.
he wrote to me. He wrote to me 20 years later. And
Wow.
he said, no, sorry, 10 years later. He wrote to me and he said, it took me 10 years after I left. He'd been a high-ranking executive in the sea organization and he couldn't get a job because he didn't have any qualifications. And so he ended up being a builder's laborer. You know, and he's a really lovely guy. It's a guy I really like. But he wrote to me and he wrote apologizing for the rotten things he said about me, and I knew nothing about this, and saying, you know, it took me 10 years trying to get my head around what had happened to me. And then I read A Piece of Blue Sky and realized, and, you know, his journey was from there. So, you know, sometimes what we do can be helpful. What's important, I think, is that we live what we believe. We live what we talk. And that's not something you see in any cult group. You know, it's all, you know, Rajneesh coming out going, me nasty, me nasty. And you know that he's just had 50 milligrams of diazepam in it.
That's right. You know, John, thank you. I needed to hear a lot of that. I have my mood swings and ups and downs like everybody, and I think maybe more than everybody in some ways. I'm not trying, again, you know, I don't try to go out of my way to try to make myself different or anything like that from other people, but what I spend my day doing is quite different from what most other people do, and I am exposed to a great deal of really harsh, nonsensical stuff and the worst of human behavior in many, many ways. And it can be draining. And
it is.
And I need to be reminded of that sometimes too, because I still, you know, you talk about childhood trauma and how long does it take to get over it? Well, maybe you never do. There are certain things that go into place. There are certain genes that get activated. There's certain biological processes that happen. And once those things activate, you don't get it. You don't get a redo on some things. This is why beating your child or spanking them and stuff is so horrifically awful. And I really wish people would like get a clue about that. Well, I got spanked and I'm fine. No, you're not, because you think beating on your kid's cool. Like, dude, you know, anyway, point is that maybe some of that childhood trauma doesn't ever get a chance to go away, and you just basically have to deal with it. And one of the things that I have to deal with is my fear of failure and my desire to want to, if I'm not doing it big, I'm not doing it at all. Yeah. And I know, I see instantly when I say it, the falsity of it. I do get it. I'm just saying that these things are kind of implanted up here. It's not a choice that I can just turn some of these knobs and levers off. And that's part of my struggle, I guess, with this. And I know I get the purity of wanting to help people. That's never been tainted. That's never been stained. That's not something I feel like I don't want to do anymore or anything like that. It just gets hard sometimes because you feel like, am I doing anything? Is it really mattering? Does it really make a difference? And of course it does. And I just need to be reminded of that sometimes.
Yeah, it's also really important that we keep asking that question, because when you look at the Christian missionaries who went out into Africa and, you know, Micronesia, Polynesia, and destroyed the cultures they met, because they were convinced that they were giving something positive and wonderful. And it's not to say, you know, some of them did, you know, they brought, you know, medicines and help. But if you look at accounts of, you know, Polynesia when Gauguin was there in the 1890s, that he was looking for paradise to go and paint it, having been thrown out by his wife. All of this nonsense about him abandoning her, it's not true. There's a letter from her saying, you have to leave, because otherwise my uncle won't pay for our children's education. So that's a nonsense. But he went there to go to Eden and found syphilis and colonial depredation, and in fact spent more of his time working, publicizing that, writing a journal called Sourire, or Laughter, to attack the French colonials. He's considered a saint there. But people went with the intention of doing good. You know, I'm going to go and do some good. And they did harm. They often did harm. And so we do have to question what we're doing. I always felt really good about the thing with Scientology because all I was doing was exposing what Ron Hubbard had said and how people had responded to it. So I had there was no fear that I was selling the wrong idea that would become harmful later down. If you look at eugenics and the way that developed through the 20th century in America, in Sweden, in Britain, where the word was first coined by Galton, bless him, and the Institute of Eugenics was founded. But Hitler gets that, and you have the T4 program, and 180,000 or however many disabled people are murdered by their own doctors because the culture, flows into, that we're getting rid of deficiency, we're getting rid of disability, and you're not thinking about, these are human beings, and as soon as you lose your humanity and are willing to consider other people vermin that have to be destroyed, then you have lost your humanity. So always finding that balance, always questioning, always saying, I absolutely resonate with what you're saying. I've spent my whole life going, why am I wasting my time doing this? I could have been tap dancing. I could have been the new Fred Astaire, and look what I've done. And I do lots of other things. I play the drums, I sing, I paint, I write novels, and I've done all of these things professionally, and they're all a lot more fun than being harassed by Scientology. But and I do sometimes question that. I do sometimes think, I've devoted myself to this thing, but I also feel that there are only a very few of us. I now know that. If I talk to, a friend of mine who's a counsellor in Holland, highly professionally qualified and all this, and with long experience, she says that among the tens of thousands of people licensed to counsel in Holland, there are only 4 to whom she would send a former cult member. And there are lots of people in that field who are, they just don't have a clue what they're doing, frankly. They want to do, eye movement desensitization and reprocessing or something like that. And they really think that that's a way of dealing with stress in people. I
have an interview right now with a woman locally here who was a therapist who's helped people out of cults and or who does therapy, and she does EMDR. We talked about it.
Yeah, and it's a derivative of neurolinguistic programming. It's a hypnotic form. It may well cause a change, but I would aver that if you don't know why the change was caused in you, and you're dealing with thoughts and beliefs, then you have gone into dangerous ground, because it's like doing Scientology, and Scientology will make you feel better. But is feeling better, feeling euphoric, feeling high, feeling good, is that the thing? I would say that actually, and I also don't believe in having to go over and over trauma. I think that, a cognitive behavioral approach of finding a new way to behave is probably more useful than spending your whole life going over and over what happened to you. But I think until the individual has understood it, that any method that doesn't go to that, you can, EMDR may allow the person to think about why they became trapped in that loop that they're in. But there is some devastating evidence about EMDR that's starting to be released, and that nothing that I've seen in the studies supporting it is valuable. That even a luminary such as Bessel van der Kolk supporting it, I don't see the evidence. I don't see the proper controls. I don't, people feel better afterwards. Well, great. I often talk with therapists, and because we come from a therapy cult, we're kind of going, yeah, we used to do that too.
Right. Yeah, no, it was a real big thing when I realized, when it hit me, again, fairly recently, with neuroscience study, that just because you feel good doesn't necessarily mean that's an inherently good thing. You don't have to automatically put a value judgment on awe or euphoria. Sometimes those are bad things, and you got to contextualize Where are you going with this? That's right. It's a good point.
Just watch 5 minutes of Triumph of the Will, the Nuremberg Rally, and see how happy those people are.
Jesus, good point. Yeah, very good
So
point.
we resolve things. I'm people who know me know that I'm really not a big fan of Sigmund Freud. I've been saying bad things about him for 30 years now. But he did say one thing when he took Joseph Breuer's failed method, which Hubbard would later call Dianetics. The only person, Anna Fourneau, that it was tried on ended up in an asylum as a morphine addict. And Joseph Breuer signed the admission form, having prescribed the morphine to her. And that was the end. That was the first successful case upon which Freud based his work, and which would then become the Dianetics process. There's a piece of it. But nonetheless, Freud, when he talked about this in the Worcester, Massachusetts lectures, where he describes the Dianetic process, counting back from 10, the repeater, the chains of incidents, the possibility that there is a physical as well as an emotional incident in the chain, the earliest incident on the chain. It's all there in 1911. So
no shit.
It's all there the year that Hubbard's born. So he wasn't body at that time.
Wow.
But he says at the end of that conversation, he says, but I had to abandon it because it does not resolve the transference, which is to say that the person is still not able to form relationships, not able to attach to other people properly in a sensible way. And he said, what's more, it increases the dependence on the therapist. So you have to, with EMDR, with anything, you have to say, well, what are our criteria? And how long a study do you need? You need to watch people for 3 years, 5 years afterwards. And you have to see to what extent do their lives really improve. Not, I'd like to sign a testimonial now,
Yeah, the Scientology proof is success stories, testimonials. Yeah, exactly. Right? That's the proof.
Yeah, as it has been with just about every cult through the ages. It's saying, I feel great now. I feel really blissed out. Well, it's not that. Is that person a bully? Is that person a good spouse? Is that person a good parent? The most important thing we will ever be. How do their kids get on in life? And when you start looking at people like Freud and Jung and Wilhelm Reich, you realize that their lives were absolutely chaotic. That Jung was despicably promiscuous with his clients, and yet is still one of the pillars of modern thinking. Freud had 33 operations on his throat and never realized that he needed to stop smoking. Also, as Robin Williams said, he took enough cocaine to kill a small horse, and wrote papers about how great cocaine was and caused addiction to cocaine among his patients. So we have to be a little suspicious about therapists, I think, the measures have to be objective. And the reality is we're seeing a failure in therapy schools all over the world. And I would attribute it to just one thing, and that is you either have a therapeutic personality or you don't. And if you get into therapy because you're a narcissist, and many, I'm afraid, they have a higher proportion than you'll find in other professions, you're not going to actually help people all that much. If you get into therapy because you want to be paid a lot of money, then that's not really the best reason. Some people, when you sit with them, half an hour later, you feel better again. That's the therapeutic personality. It doesn't need a system. It doesn't need anything. It's just that some people are encouraging and supportive, and they can get you to think about, the life-affirming things you can do. When I met Margaret Singer, she's the only person I've let near me therapeutically to therapy me. I mean, I'd be very happy to talk to my friend Christian Shirko if I felt I needed to, because he's brilliant. But I met Margaret, and I knew I was back in, around Berkeley 6 months later. This was in '93. And I said, "Look, will you therapy me?" That was her word for it. And we sat down for 3 hours, and I said, I hadn't thought about what I was going to say. I said, well, I got very upset when Jimi Hendrix died, back in 1970s. Where is this coming from? And she sat and listened to me for a couple of hours. And then I realized that she did what I did, which is you sit with someone and you say, well, what's the problem? And they tell you. And when they start repeating themselves, you say, well, what could you do about it? And then they say, well, they offer you, say 5 things. And 3 of them will be kind of crazy. 1 of them will get them locked up. And the other one might possibly work. And you just say, well, I'd do that then. And that, when it came down to it, for me, most of it is people feeling supported, feeling they aren't idiots, feeling that they do have the right to make decisions. And most of the problems that we have are to do with our relationships, and to do, JP Sears did I love JP Sears when he's being funny, but when he tries to give advice, psychological advice, he's a half-wit. And
who is this now? JPC?
JP Sears, Ultra Spirituality.
Oh.
On YouTube. He's done the stuff about frightening vegans with bacon, and, he's a bit harsh at times, but he's
got it.
He's very, very funny. But he also has a second strand, which is where he gives advice. So he gives advice about depression, and he says, basically, snap out of it. He has not understood the difference between a reactive depression or being unhappy, which is not actually depression, and endogenous depression, where everything's fine, but you feel awful. And so he's just like, basic psychological advice, snap out of it. I mean, Bob Newhart's video, Stop It.
I was just about to bring that up. About as effective as this poor woman, the skit Bob Newhart did years ago. This poor woman comes to him and she's terrified of getting locked in a box. And he says,
buried.
okay. Yeah. And he says, yeah, Barry, that's right. And he says, stop it. And she's like, that's it? And he goes, okay.
Well, you still have 3 minutes.
That's right. So give the punchline. It's awesome.
Right, at the end of the 3 minutes, he says, at first he says, I'm going to tell you in 2 words what to do. At the end, he says, I'm going to tell you in 10 words what to do. Stop it, or I'm going to bury you in a box.
Exactly. It was awful. It's like
therapeutic comprehension. I love Bob Newhart.
It was awesome. It was awesome.
But JP Sears does this thing. I had to do a little YouTube about it, which I haven't published yet, but because it got me. He's talking about narcissists, and he says it's not the narcissist. It's because you are pathetic. You have patheticness, and your patheticness-ism, he keeps going. And you think, is he trying to be funny? And I don't think he is. He's suggesting that people live with narcissists because it's their fault, rather than saying, let's go a step further. Narcissistic personality disorder is thoroughly curable. It's not, something wrong with the brain. Once a narcissist actually gets the way they're behaving, they can change. It does happen. So the way to solve a relationship with a narcissist, I'm not saying it's easy.
I know, I'm looking askance at you, right? I'm a little bit like,
The reason something is listed as a personality disorder is because it's curable, as opposed to a mental illness, which is not, which is why I think the Antisocial Personality Disorder in DSM-5, Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, number 5, the current one, I think they're wrong. It's not the Antisocial Personality Disorder is a mental illness. It's a deficiency in the brain, and it's fine to call them psychopaths. It's not a bad thing. So, when it's called a personality disorder, it means there are treatments for it. And my friend in Seattle, Professor Kirk Honda, who does a podcast called Psychology in Seattle, he has been treating people with narcissistic personality disorder for some time. There's a significant problem, which is getting them to accept that they have it.
I was going to say, it seems to me the first barrier and the biggest one is getting them into the chair in the first place.
Yeah. But yeah, rather than treating it that you basically are inherently a pathetic person and therefore desire to be abused, that's not really, the best of solutions.
I would say no. I'd say not. Okay, I think we're going to move to wrapping up this talk right now, because we
probably should.
Yeah, we've talked for a while about some good stuff here, and I think I started with in a place that I didn't necessarily expect to start today, but I think you've done a championship job walking me through some things that have really helped me out here, and I appreciate that.
Thank you. How kind.
Yeah. Well, that's what we're trying to do, is we're trying to be kind, and we're trying to help people out there. And
And help each other.
yeah, exactly.
Because, I have not achieved enlightenment or Satori or Buddhahood. I ask the same questions that you ask. And,
Right.
luckily have enough friends, when I'm going, what's the point of all this, to say, well, remember this.
Well, I
Um,
appreciate it, because this isn't the first time I've had this conversation, obviously, with you and others, and I need the morale boost from time to time, like I think anybody does who's in our position, where you're trying to take it upon yourself to try to assist your fellow man and woman, and sometimes that can be trying, sometimes it can be defeating, sometimes sometimes you don't succeed, sometimes you fail and you lose, and they stay in the cult, or they stay in the relationship, or they keep making the bad decisions, and you go, well, I hope at some point they have a
or
change
they
of heart.
decide that you're the target and
Oh
spend
God.
several
Yes.
years attacking you at every opportunity. Oh,
Yeah, I've definitely had that too, and I have compassion for those people. I really do. I don't have there are I can't think of anybody that I hate.
no, and
You
I
know.
think that's a supremely important point. I
Yeah.
so far nobody has annoyed me enough that I want to harm them. Now,
Yeah.
if somebody hurt my children, I might change my mind about that, or my grandchild, I might change my mind about it. But so far, there's nobody who's attacked me that I wouldn't be happy to have a conversation with. And I, I, I don't know what that is. Maybe, I know I test high on empathy scales, and I think when we last talked, I said it's a disorder. It's not a positive thing. Um, but that may be why. But I don't, I feel resentful and irritated and annoyed and all of those things. But I don't hate, loathe, detest people. I do want them. When you start talking about somebody like Mao Zedong, and if you read Jung Chang's and John Holliday's astonishing Mao, the Unknown Story, then like me, you'll probably get to the page where it describes the kind of tortures he liked to watch. And like me, you'll put the book down for 2 weeks and not be able to pick it up again. It's the only time it's ever happened to me. I've read all that stuff about Auschwitz and Belsen and what have you, and I've managed. And on that point, perhaps to close with, it's worth saying that there are people who have been through horrific abuse and have been able to use that. And I always come to the example of Viktor Frankl. Frankl not only wrote Man's Search for Meaning, which is, my copy says it sold more than 9 million copies, which is a man talking about Dachau and Auschwitz, where he was, and yet distilling something. Joseph Campbell said it's an ambrosial book because, it gives hope, even despite it. But you then go further with this man, Frankl, and you find that he didn't stop there. What's it called? The Doctor and the Soul. I have a friend who's a professor of psychology, and she said, this is the best book I've ever read, The Doctor and the Soul, where he says, there's a problem in psychotherapy in that it doesn't deal with spirituality. Now, me personally, I'm not all that interested in spirituality. I've got no
Me
idea.
neither.
But he's right in that he's saying, if you have a religious conviction and you come to a therapist, how do you fit these two things together?
That's a good point. You do have to treat the person in front of you, and more people than not are going to have spiritual beliefs. That's for sure.
And you can go the way that Rollo May went with existential therapy, which is pretty much stop it. If you believe the wrong things, that's why you're screwed up. You're going to die. Get on with it. You can try that, which I don't think is a brilliant approach. Or I just naturally, on leaving Scientology, whenever somebody came to me from any persuasion, I'd say, well, what do you believe? And it startled me. I asked for character references because I'd been accused of certain things. I asked for character references from two friends who knew me very well, who were both Christians. And they both spontaneously wrote that I'd helped them improve their faith. Because when they came to me, I said, well, what, you pray and stuff like that. How does this fit in with what you believe? And at the time, it's about 1985 when you're leaving Scientology, so you still want new words for things. I called it the meta paradigm. The idea that when you approach another human being, you're not seeking to inflict your beliefs on them. You're seeking to go, well, what will work for you? And you really don't want to know what I believe, because look at me, look where it's taken me. You wouldn't want to go here, but deal with people where they believe. And through his logotherapy, Viktor Frankl was able to do that and change the world in some ways. And I think there are plenty of good people out there. They just don't have the tools to do it. And our job is giving them the tools to do it. And then, we can go on holiday, get some time off.
Exactly. Well, there was nothing that has filled me over all the years that I've done this. And I guess I get to say that now. We're all the years that I've done this.
All years. Many years.
There's been actually nothing that has brought a bigger smile to my face and more pride in my work than when I've been contacted, and it's happened multiple times, by college teachers and high school teachers who have been using my work in their classes.
Yeah.
That came out of nowhere. It always comes out of nowhere. It's just some left field email or comment or something, and I'm always just blown away by it, because that tells me that I'm doing something worthwhile.
Yeah, I mean, any time and every time that somebody thanks me for doing what I'm doing, it's a wonderful thing. So please,
exactly.
Let's have a shower of adulation here.
Yeah, exactly. All right, guys. Well, John, thank you for taking the time and doing this. We'll be getting together again soon, I'm sure.
Yeah, great.
Yeah, because we got to talk about those levels, actually. You mentioned those levels, those steps of leaving Scientology. I had always attributed those to Arnie Lerma, because that's where I first read about him.
Well, I wrote something about it, but
and then he built on it, I think.
It's possible. I mean, he and I passed like ships in the night because I was being wiped out as he was coming onto the scene.
Yeah, he grabbed onto some good stuff, and when I first got out, he was one of the first voices I heard, and some of his work really helped me out. And he had like 6 stages of leaving, and I could see it myself, and I went, "Oh my God, that's so true!" And I've seen it in almost everybody leaving since.
Yeah. I mean, it is. It's very apparent, and people often get stuck at a particular place. I mean, what I'd like to do. I'm not a big fan of Kubler-Ross's work in general or her theories, but I think the 5 stages of grieving can be applied to leaving a group and saying, well, the first thing will be denial. It didn't hurt me.
Right.
Did no harm.
Exactly. All right, guys.
But we'll do that later.
Yeah, we will. We will tackle that and many other things. Any questions, comments, or feedback that you might have on this podcast, things we've talked about, good, bad, or sideways, it's where I'm open to criticism. I'm just not interested in ad hominem. I'm not interested in being called names. You want to leave comments on my channel of a critical nature or positive nature, I will appreciate both.
And any questions that we might answer in future discussions are most welcome.
Yeah, exactly. Please. Yeah, put them down there, and we will take a look at them. Thanks for coming around and watching, regardless, and sticking through all the way through all of this. We appreciate your viewership, and I'll see you guys later.
Yep,
Bye-bye.
Thanks so much.